This week is technically the first installment, and we're super excited to welcome Ben Creech, a film and video maker based in Chicago. Next week, we'll be welcoming a German animator based in the UK named Eva Munich, so make sure to keep your eyes open for more information on that. But without further ado, I want to give a warm welcome to Ben Creech, who is here with us today. Ben, I'll let you have the floor to tell us a bit about who you are, what you do, where you're from, maybe what brought you to Chicago. Thank you.
Sure. Hi. Thanks for having me. My name's Ben. I'm a video maker and teacher living in Chicago. I'm from Louisville, Kentucky originally. I moved up here about 10 years ago to go to the University of Chicago to do graduate school, and then have been working up here as a teacher and sort of barista and artist in different capacities since. That's sort of my background. I started making videos in 2017, shortly after having left the classroom, kind of in an official sense, where I had been adjuncting for a while, but adjuncting doesn't really work long term. You can't really sustain that. But I also wanted to find a way to teach outside of classrooms. And so video making became kind of a way to explore alternative possibilities for teaching. And so then I went back to school, studied filmmaking, and here we are. Yeah. Many videos later.
Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. Really thrilled that you're here with us on ImageUnion and that we have the chance to share and discuss some of your work. So we're going to try to get to 3 of your works today, but I'd like to begin with a recent work of yours from 2020 called CICERO Mount Greenwood. So I want to start with this piece because I think it's an incredible and really important piece of art and shows a lot about the social conscious and issues that are important to you that you bring with you into your art or video making. So we'll have a chance to discuss the film after we watch it. But before we start, would you like to say a word or two about what we're about to see and why you made this film?
Yeah, sure. The film is something that I made kind of in a frenzy of attention. I guess that's always the case, isn't it, with films? But CICERO Mount Greenwood essentially presents 3 protests, but 2 protests that occur about 50 years apart, and just a few miles apart in Chicago. CICERO has a long history of being a suburb for white people to have different rules than their neighbors. And so the CICERO March was a march that happened in 1966. It was documented by the film group, and I worked with Chicago Film Archives to use the footage. The march was about, desegregating housing in CICERO. The protests in 2016 revolved around a murder of a 25-year-old Black father, Joshua Beal, who was murdered by the community of Mount Greenwood. And when people showed up to protest, the counter protest was so overwhelming. And so I was particularly struck by the thought that what these images look like was like the Deep South in the 50s, as opposed to like Chicago. Chicagoans have a certain sensibility when it comes to, Northerners, Southerners, feeling like quite progressive, but there's a lot that happens here that people don't want to look at. And so I was just interested in this idea of like, what does history look like in Chicago? Even though we talk about it like it's this specter from elsewhere. But yeah, so I took these 2 protests and I cut them together to make the images match. And so what we're going to see is a lot of editing and a lot of images. And so it's a lot visually, but that's kind of the concept behind it. Yeah, we'll talk more about it afterwards, I guess.
Yeah, thanks for that.
I don't want to give all the spoilers away.
All right. So let's cut over to the film. It's about 10 minutes. And then, stick around for the conversation about it afterwards.
So yeah, if you just checking in, we're at Western and 111th. The march was supposed to go through Mount Greenwood, and as soon as we got here, they showed up in force with basically a military force of police. No, they got a helicopter coming maybe, or that might be a plane going into Midway. But yeah, they don't want to let us through, and they're saying they'll arrest everybody if we try to get through the line and go to Mount Greenwood. So we're on the perimeter keeping an eye on them. It's been an extremely jubilant and peaceful march up until now. But they don't want us to march to their neighborhood because there is a murderer that lives there.
Signed off on. The whole damn system was involved. And I want to ask you, which side are you on? Law and order! Law and order! Law and order!
Send those killer cops to jail. The whole damn system is guilty as hell.
I feel like it's the media that spreads the lies that the police put out. Because what did they do after the cop murdered LaQuan McDonald? Some other cops tried to destroy the evidence. This ain't the 60s. This ain't the 60s. The way you act like it is. We don't want to race war. We don't want to.
Hey!
Chicago, bitch! I live in Chicago!
You want to say somebody to these people? Listen, you got several hundred officers here. Every time we protest, if we step foot on the damn street, we're going to jail. Tell them to get off the streets. Don't be anywhere there.
Keep coming, don't stop. You fat punk, I see what you made out of. You fat punk, and your mama too. Cut it out, cut it out. Keep the sign inside the light, all the way inside. Keep on the you come on. What you is supposed to do is
We can do this another day, but this is election day. If they lose this is going to go bad. We have to go.
Thank you so much for
Great.
Awesome film. It's such an awesome way of
Thank you.
juxtaposing past and present. So some of my first questions I want to ask you about are sort of about the footage, like how you found this archival footage of the CICERO march and how you gathered all the different footage for the protest from 2016. Like where you got that from and how you decided to put it together. So I'd love to hear about your editing process too, like sort of how you decided to put which two images together.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, first, I think that one of the most significant film watching experiences I've ever had was the first time I saw The Murder of Fred Hampton, one of the great Chicago films. It was made by the Film Group, and they also made American Revolution 2 and several other works. Prior to this, they shot a series of educational films. That series, the earliest installment of it is Cicero March. And so I had a familiarity with the Fred Hampton film going way back, but had been exposed to the other films in their collection after doing some work with the Chicago Film Archive. And I mean, it's incredible stuff seeing the political archival material that's occurring like in your actual backyard. And this is true both in a political sense, but also in an aesthetic sense. And this is what's so great about CFA and Media Burn's work in this regard, is that that's so important. But so I had a familiarity of the Cicero March, but on June 7th, the sort of footage that opens the film, June 7th, there was a protest that sort of had arrived at the border of Mount Greenwood and that reached a barricade and was prohibited from entering Mount Greenwood. Within a week, protesters were able to get through that barricade, and a larger march, occurred. And so, but that barricade led me to think, like, what is the deal with this neighborhood, and why does no one talk about it? And so I started looking into Mount Greenwood's history and seeing all the people that actually have written about it quite extensively. Like I quoted Isabel Wilkerson from, 30 years ago now. And yet, you can talk to many people in Chicago who will never have heard of Mount Greenwood. And so part of my interest was in changing that and sort of like finding a way to get the neighborhood name sort of said more often. But I needed, I also had read these sort of reports, and I mentioned this in the intro. I'd read these reports that had compared these protests that are on the right to the South. And I was like, well, actually, what does Chicago look like then and now? What is just the objective difference? I also was thinking about how we live in a moment where we have more cameras and more images, being generated than ever before. And yet sometimes, like, I take so much footage that doesn't go anywhere. You know what I mean? Like, I just take so much footage and it doesn't go anywhere. And so many people do as well. And so I started to think about, like, what is the utility of like finding a way to like present or package certain events, through essentially, collective spectator sampling. Kevin B. Lee does something similar in his Transformers pre-make. But I was sort of interested in, like, what are we to do with all this footage? And if I can find a way to just like take this excess and put on a constraint that allows me to have like an arbitrary reason for cutting out most of what I watched. Because I watched like hours upon hours upon hours of footage shot by people who were in the protest, as people who were surrounded. Like, we see that footage of largely the woman talking. And there are other instances that are footage from, on the side of the counter protesters, like when they're cheering when they pass the side of Beale's murder. So I saw all this crazy footage, and it's just like, what do I do with all this? But I was like, well, if it looks like the past, let's just be literal with it and make it look like the past. And so I just went through and kind of like was able to do the sorting in my head of this shot matches this shot, this thing is this thing, and worked it over the course essentially of 4 days. And so it was just like something I had a vision for and I could sort of like work at. And then it was very intuitive what I matched with what. Like, if I thought too long about it, I don't think I would have finished it. I think it would be one of these projects that I work on for 2 years, but it was very much just intuitively finding those matches between the archival film and the contemporary one. I reached out to CFA and I was like, hey, can I sample this film? I think it's fair use. Can I sample this? Can I just do whatever I want with it? And they, were very generous and gave me, permission. They were like, you've got our blessing. Just put our name in the credits. And then I was just like, but what am I gonna say, you know? And I think this is an important thing, is that like a lot of films have messages, right, that you're supposed to decode from like thinking about the film and the film's construction, all this. I don't think my films really have messages so much as like facts that they present, and sort of you can grapple with them or, you know, focus on one part or another part. But like in the end, I think that the juicy stuff sort of happens in the conversation after, when people are like, what did I just see? Like, what am I, not like, here's the message of this film. So I'm not sure that I have like a specific message with the film, though the theme of like history repeating is certainly, you know, at play. But I would say I don't think history repeats, it accumulates. What we're not really seeing here is something that's like simply an echo of the past, but which is itself a whole new beast, that's, you know, updated to a modern era, you know. And it's just, we sometimes, especially in blue cities like Chicago, we sort of imagine ourselves to be in a place where that doesn't happen, and it does, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to ask you a bit more about sort of the timeline. So this film was made in 2020. I wanted to ask, like, was that because obviously 2020 is when a lot of the Black Lives Matters protests were happening. Did that sort of moment inform your filmmaking process as well?
Yes, yeah, I was actively interested in this idea of, you know, everyone, and this is true, that everyone plays their part in the, you know, sort of unraveling of it all. We all have a job that we're going to do in, you know, the ending of capitalism. And like at the time I was, you know, in the past I've been like, you know, I'll run out the door and be at the protest. But at the time I was, you know, living with my partner and her kid, and was a new parent. And so I was not really in the same kind of position that I was in when I was, you know, sort of a single person before, and like had only myself to concern with. You know, I have all these other concerns, you know. And so I was interested in rethinking my relationship to the struggle and trying to figure out like how I fit in it now as a parent and as, you know, like an artist, as well as an activist. And so that's sort of, you know, some of what was going on in my head, at least at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Another thing I wanted to ask about was the subtitle of the film, that's like a reconstruction of a race riot, or which side are you on? Can you talk a little bit to that?
Yeah, like race riot's a funny term where like it's sort of used in a certain way now that I think is ignorant of its history sometimes, where like there's like a right-wing usage of this term race riot that's essentially like in reference to uprisings, right? In reference to protests. But race riot as a historical term always refers to white people losing their shit at Black people moving in. And so like I was interested in calling these things race riots and calling these things sort of like putting them in that historical context, right? But so a reconstruction of a race riot was me sort of reconstructing these things as events. And then which side are you on is one of the lyrics of the song, one of the songs that are sung. But I was also curious about the relationship of the film to like both sides, right? Like which side are you on? But which side are you on? But like, you know, and there are these sort of like layers to just like this feeling of, I could say it again, which side are you on? You know, it's like, it just means several things. So I like it.
Yeah, it functions on like multiple levels within the film, both like which side in terms of which time period, and then within the contemporary itself, there's two sides. Yeah, it's super interesting. But I'd like to have time to get to at least one of the next two films. So I think
Yes.
if you're cool shifting to Psycho 64 now, I think that's a good time to do it. So do you want to say a few words about Psycho 64, and then we can show a short excerpt of it?
Why don't we just show a short excerpt of it? Yeah.
Okay, sure. With this film, you chose a really iconic scene from a very iconic film. So I wanted to ask, what's your relationship to Psycho? Is it a favorite movie of yours?
I think it's a great movie. I mean, it's one of the great movies, right? I would not call this though fan art. This isn't like in tribute to Psycho and of in honor of my love for Psycho. This is like it's like a teaching tool. I mean, in another context, we might call this something like an etude, right? Like it's like a study piece. And specifically, it's a study of montage. The idea of like being able to see spatially time as it plays out across different image forms. It's very hard to see montage. Montage is not something that you can take a picture of. Like you cannot see, like you can sample a shot. You can be like, this is my favorite shot. That's my favorite shot. That's my favorite shot. You can't say that's my favorite cut. Like where is the cut? But what's so interesting about montage is that the cut is where we get in. And so how do we, develop an understanding of some of these images that we're bombarded with, right? We don't really even fully understand, I think, most of the images, even the ones we know well, So I was trying to look at Psycho in a new way. I was trying to find a way to see the montage spatially, to make it look like a fabric or a quilt or, like something like this, like that would change your relationship to it. But it was, there's actually another version of it that's Psycho 196 that's vertical and that runs, there's 196 images of it instead of 64. That's how I originally made it, but then I was like, this looks cool, but it's too much. So I simplified it. But yeah, that's some of my thinking there.
Mm-hmm. Do you think a different movie would have had the same impact as Psycho in terms of your exploration of montage? And
I think that I mean, that sequence is like iconic. And so like that sequence, and thinking of that sequence graphically, right? Like that sequence is storyboarded by Saul Bass. So it's not even just like, a filmmaker shooting a shower. It's like a graphic designer designing shots in montage. And it's so fast, you can't see it. You could take another sequence that was as interesting and do this to, and it would be as interesting. I think it would be mesmerizing no matter what you did this to, because it's sort of mesmerizing. But I was interested in, like like I've got another film for example that's called Boogie, and it is what it does is it essentially holds a sustain pedal on each frame for a full second, so that any given second you're seeing 24 equally exposed frames of the opening shot of Boogie Nights. And so it makes you feel sort of drunk and drugged out as you go through this nightclub because of all these frames. But that process could have been done to anything. But I was like interested in what are these like long tracking shots, and it matches because it's the club. Psycho has similar things where it's like it matches because of the ways in which the images are already designed. You know, the repetitions are already built in. The eyes over and over again, like there are these things that you get to see in a new way. Like, so it's just sort of, it works like that. And when I find, you know, a way to turn a shtick like that, then I don't need to try it on a bunch of different films. Once I find the one that fits, I kind of let it sort of be that. So this is sort of it's like the technique as well as the concept. But you could do the technique on a different film, you know, it would be interesting.
Mm-hmm. And I imagine one thing that's noticeable is that there's no sound on it. And sound in this
right.
is also really iconic that, you know, that, so what
you sort of hear it automatically, like it's already there for you. It's like an after image, but acoustically, you know, like the experience of looking at an image and then looking at a blank surface and it lingers some, you know, that experience, but acoustically is what happens when you're looking at that sequence mute. And you're like, oh, I still kind of hear those Bernard Herrmann strings. Yeah, I think that it's interesting. I crafted it just as an image trick. And so I ended up just removing the sound from it because I wanted there to be no extra layers to it. But I like the absence of sound for this exact reason, that it sort of makes you aware of how much you have already got on like autoplay with this sequence, like how hard it is to see it fresh, you know, because we just know it so intimately. Like you can just make that sound and people know what you're talking about. Like, so how do we even look at something like that fresh?
Yeah, that's a super interesting thought. Cool. I think we can move on to the last year films now.
Cool.
Derby Chop. I think we can also just show the clip and then talk about it afterwards. So let's show that.
Louisville is host to the American racing world today, and Churchill Downs is pouring into the infield and stands for 8 hours. It's the 65th annual Kentucky Derby Day. 70,000 fans from every state of the union and from every walk of life are here for the biggest moment in American racing.
95,000 strong, they jam Kentucky's Churchill Downs for the 66th running of America's fourth race of the year. And only moments to go before the fire goes along the way to the coast, let's see who this.
first question, why the Kentucky Derby as a subject for this film? What's your relationship to the Kentucky Derby? Yeah.
Yeah. I think that one way to answer this question would be to say, so I had it in my head years ago, like 5 years ago. I started getting this idea in my head that someone should tell the story of Kentucky cinema, of like what Kentucky cinema was, and like that it existed. What was its history, you know? And what was funny to me is actually similar to Mount Greenwood. I could talk to people in Chicago. I'd be like, Kentucky cinema, and they'd be like, what are you talking about? That's not a real thing, you know, like what Kentucky cinema, you know, Harlan County, USA, is that what you mean? You know, and what I meant was something much more complex because of Kentucky's unique, well, not unique among, you know, all places, but unique in its place, you know, relationship to how images about it are produced. Some of that is also about the, you know, symbolic qualities of Appalachia, which are shared by several, you know, states in the region, but really just this, I was sort of motivated by this, you know, as a constraint to put on the excess of possibility. I could think of just, you know, like what was the history of Kentucky cinema. And so I started to ask myself, like, how do I know that there were filmmakers, you know, like in Chicago, there were a lot of independent micro filmmakers whose work only is known today because of the work of Media Burn and Chicago Film Archives, you know. And so without institutions like that in Kentucky, some of the same kind of work could very easily be lost. And so in an attempt to kind of anticipate this, I started thinking, like, how do I know there are cameras in Kentucky, right? And the Kentucky Derby is how you know that there is all kinds of stuff in Kentucky, because like the Queen of England goes to the Kentucky Derby. Like, it's crazy who goes to the Kentucky Derby. But if you go to the Kentucky Derby, like, you do not go to the Kentucky Derby without encountering steep divides in class, because there is a servant class that sort of surrounds the whole Derby atmosphere. Like, you sort of play into various roles of, you know, nostalgia. But my experience with Derby, I never actually went to the Derby. I watched the Derby on TV. And so the images I saw every year kind of looked the same, and were all from the same angles, you know, except they were slightly different, as the video sort of shows, right? But I had this, you know, concept prior to the Derby last year, because there were sort of 100 Derbies that I was able to track down full film copies of. And I was like, oh, that's a perfect grid. I could do a perfect box like that. And as you can see, many of the like angles are exactly the same. But the little differences are sort of interesting, you know. There's nothing to it but the facts. So it's just like, it's interesting that these 2 minutes throughout history are always recorded, you know, like that there's always people at this event in this place in time every year without fail. That's kind of interesting too. And so it's just like, it's sort of a small work to me, in a similar way to the Psycho film, in that it was sort of just like, let me take this little concept and flip it. But it's part of several works that fit under this Kentucky Cinema project, and also a project that I call Louisville Plays Itself, which is just about the history of image production in Louisville, Kentucky, which is where I'm from. I made another Derby film that's called 2 Minutes 1970, that uses an audiobook recording by Tim Robbins as Hunter S. Thompson reading an excerpt from the Derby as Decadent and Depraved. So basically I made it so that Hunter S. Thompson was the racetrack announcer for the race that year. So little things like that. But you know, I have another film that samples from Stripes and uses the text of Thomas Merton that's in this series. And so it's just like a series of film projects that this is sort of a part of.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So this is sort of like the third film we've seen where you're putting images side by side with each other. And in this case, of Derby Chop a lot of images similar to the 64. So how it's like a very distinct style. And I'd like to hear how exactly like you came to that sort of style of putting images side by side with each other, or if you can name any sort of influences for that style where you saw it first and why you thought that was sort of the style you wanted to adopt or develop.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because it is like a style that I employ for certain purposes, but it's not the only style that I employ. But in these instances, you're right. Like all of these are split screen. All of these have, you know, the box broken up. I think I'm interested in disrupting the coherent relationships that we have to images. When we are in a cinema, we're in a kind of immersive experience. And so we're surrounded, we're bathed in sound and light. And we're not really, we think we're seeing everything, but we're not really like, we're just kind of like in the vibe, you know? When it's split screen, it's not that we're like deprived of any information. We're just more aware that we're not seeing at all. And that to me feels somehow more honest when it comes to the information. I feel like when you're showing one thing, it's very easy to convince the viewer that that's like the whole world. But if you need these two things in tension or talking to each other, they need to be, you know, talking to each other. I think the only other way to get at some of the difference and repetition that's present in stuff like the Psycho or the Derby Chop is to do something like I was talking about with the Boogie film, which is just hyper overexposure, you know. But I don't think that you see it there. I don't think that it's as clear. I think that sometimes that does work, and I've done that in some cases, but it just seems to be the case that if you see a little rectangle on your screen, you treat that as if it's a screen. And so like we've learned this cognitively. And so it's more interesting to me to play with breaking down that logic. I think also that the grid is just also the natural consequence of the square frame, or the rectangle frame. But we forget that. Like we remember it when we're talking about pixels, you know, or grains or something like this. But we think that it's like coherent, that it's all one thing, when it's like infinite things. And so how do we get back in touch with all of the many things that it is a question I ask. So that's some of it. You know, I think also, like I said too, that we're in a moment of like having this excess of images. And if there's a way to curate those images, you know, into a fashion to where you can see something like that, to me is interesting. But dealing with the excess, we've got to deal with the excess. We can't sort of like, I don't know. So I feel sort of responsible for, you know, it's like we have image pollution, and we have to process all these excess images. But or some of us have to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a bit like what we're trying to do at ImageUnion too, is sort of, there's so much video content, we're just overloaded with it. So we're trying to restore that like bit of human touch by putting together these sort of more intentional programs and picking out little pieces of video from everywhere and putting them together. And yeah, like I said, in intentional fashion. So I think we're sort of on the same page there. It looks like we're past 45 minutes, but before we conclude, just wanted to ask you about this. I think somewhere you mentioned you describe yourself as an experimental human. And I wanted to ask a bit about, you know, why experimental human as opposed to, you know, like what we might hear, experimental filmmaker. You know, what's an experimental human?
That's a good question. I used to use that as my handle. I was thinking about how people call themselves artists. because I didn't always call myself an artist. I didn't even actually always think that I was going to be making films in the end. Like, it's crazy now, having made over 100 films, that was ever possible. But, like, it was the case that I thought that I would never make films. I just didn't think it was what my path was. And so, like, when I started, like, considering going to art school and like talking to art school folks, what I sort of found was that I considered, when we say artist, we're just talking about like the aspect of a person that's like in tune with the universe, that's like in tune with their inner child, that's like in tune, that's on the vibe. Like, everyone is an artist. Like, it's not like it's a profession. Now, nowadays there's a market, and because there's a market, there are people who work that market like they do all markets. But like, when I think of like the stuff that I like about art, I don't think about most of the stuff that I associate with the group of people who continuously call themselves artists, in the art world sense. It just is that way. I think of artist in the way that's very like human, in a way that's very like individual, very human scale. And so when I was writing my bio on Instagram, because I didn't used to be on Instagram, but when I was like, do I write experimental artist? Then I was like, well, no, not artist. Do I say filmmaker? And I was like, but that leaves out this other weird stuff I do. And some of the stuff I do is like performance art, like public performance, and like happening type stuff, like gathering type. So I was like, none of that stuff really, I don't want to list out stuff. So I was like, how do I put that in one word? And I was like, I'm just a person. And so I sort of put it like that, but thinking of those elements of the things that I'm doing as just being the parts of me that are most me, not as being sort of like some other thing that I was reaching for. Yeah.
Nice. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. So I want to thank you again for coming on and speaking with me and sharing your thoughts with the audience.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, and thank you. And just reminder that we'll have another live series next week, so make sure to tune in for German filmmaker Eva Munich. Thank you and have a nice evening.
Have a good night.
Hey, that was a pretty good show. I think I'll keep watching ImageUnion.